The War of the Worlds by H. G. Wells. Book 1. The Coming of the Martians. Chapter 15. What had happened in Surrey? The Martians resumed the offensive while the curate had sat and talked so wildly to me under the hedge in the flat meadows near Halliford, and while my brother watched the fugitive stream over Westminster Bridge. So far as one can ascertain from the conflicting accounts that have been put forth, the majority of them remained busied with preparations in the Horsell pit until 9 that night, hurrying on some operation that disengaged huge volumes of green smoke. But 3 came out about 8 o'clock and, advancing slowly and cautiously, made their way through Byfleet and Purford towards Ripley and Weybridge. So came in sight of the expectant batteries against the setting sun. These Martians did not advance in a body but in a line, each perhaps a mile and a half from his nearest fellow. They communicated through siren-like howls, running up and down the scale from one note to another. It was this howling and firing of the guns at Ripley and St. George's Hill that we had heard at Upper Halliford. The Ripley gunners, unseasoned artillery volunteers who should never have been placed in such a position, fired one wild, premature, ineffectual volley and bolted on horse and foot through the deserted village. At the same time, the Martian, without using his heat ray, walked serenely over their guns, stepped gingerly among them, passed in front of them, and so came unexpectedly upon the guns in Payne's Hill Park, which he destroyed. However, the St. George's Hill men were better led or of a better mettle. Hidden by a pine wood as they were, they seemed to have been unsuspected by the Martian nearest to them. They laid their guns as deliberately as if they had been on parade and fired at about 1,000 yards range. The shells flashed around him, and he was seen to advance a few paces, stagger, and go down. Everybody yelled together, and the guns were reloaded in frantic haste. The overthrown Martian set up a prolonged ululation, and immediately a second glittering giant, answering him, appeared over the trees to the south. A leg of the tripod had been smashed by one of the shells. The whole second volley flew wide of the Martian on the ground, and, simultaneously, both his companions brought their heat rays to bear on the battery. The ammunition blew up, the pine trees all about the guns flashed into fire, and only 1 or 2 men already running over the hill crest escaped. After this, the 3 took counsel together and halted, and the scouts who were watching them reported that they remained stationary for the next half hour. The Martian who had been overthrown crawled tediously out of his hood, a small brown figure, oddly suggestive from that distance of a speck of blight, and engaged in repairing his support. At about 9, he had finished, for his cowl was then seen above the trees again. It was a few minutes past 9 that night when these 3 sentinels were joined by 4 other Martians, each carrying a thick black tube. A similar box was handed to each of the 3. The 7 distributed themselves at equal distances along a curved line between St. George's Hill, Weybridge, and the village of Send, southwest of Ripley. A dozen rockets sprang out of the hills before them so soon as they began to move and warned the waiting batteries about Ditton and Esher. At the same time, 4 of their fighting machines, similarly armed with tubes, crossed the river. 2 of them, black against the western sky, came into sight of myself and the curate as we hurried slowly and painfully along the road northward out of Halliford. As it seemed, they moved upon a cloud, for a milky mist covered the fields and rose to 1/3 of their height. At this sight, the curate cried faintly in his throat and began running, but I knew it was no good running from a Martian, and I turned aside and crawled through dewy nettles and brambles into the broad ditch by the side of the road. He looked back, saw what I was doing, and turned to join me. The 2 halted, the nearer to us standing and facing Sunbury, the remoter being a grey indistinctness towards the evening star, away towards Staines. The occasional howling of the Martians had ceased, they took up their positions in the giant crescent about their cylinders in absolute silence. It was a crescent with 12 miles between its horns. Never since the devising of gunpowder was the beginning of a battle so still. To an observer thus about Ripley, it would have had precisely the same effect. The Martians seemed in solitary possession of the darkling night, lit only as it was by the slender moon, the stars, the afterglow of the daylight, and the ruddy glare from St. George's Hill and the woods of Payne's Hill. But facing that crescent everywhere, at Staines, Hounslow, Ditton, Esher, Ockham, behind hills and woods south of the river, and across the flat grass meadows to the north, wherever a cluster of trees or village houses gave sufficient cover, the guns were waiting. The signal rockets burst and rained their sparks through the night and vanished, and the spirit of all those watching batteries rose to a tense expectation. The Martians had but to advance into the line of fire, and instantly those motionless black forms of men, those guns glittering so darkly in the early night, would burst into a thunderous fury of battle. No doubt the thought that was uppermost in 1,000 of those sharp minds, even as it was uppermost in mine, was the riddle: how much they understood of us. Did they grasp that we, in our millions, were organized, disciplined, and working together? Or did they interpret our spurts of fire, the sudden stinging of our shells, our steady investment of their encampment, as we should the furious unanimity of onslaught in a disturbed hive of bees? Did they dream they might exterminate us? At that time, no one knew what food they needed. 100 such questions struggled together in my mind as I watched that vast sentinel shape. And in the back of my mind was the sense of all the massive unknown and hidden forces London ward. Had they prepared for pitfalls? Were the powder mills at Hounslow ready as a snare? Would the Londoners have the heart and courage to make a greater Moscow of their mighty province of houses? Then, after an interminable time, as it seemed to us, crouching and peering through the hedge, came a sound like the distant concussion of a gun. Another nearer, and then another. And then the Martian beside us raised his tube on high and discharged it, gunwise, with a heavy report that made the ground heave. The one toward Staines answered him. There was no flash, no smoke, simply that loaded detonation. I was so excited by these heavy minute guns following one another that I so far forgot my safety and my scalded hands to clamber up into the hedge and stare toward Sunbury. As I did so, a second report followed, and a big projectile hurtled overhead toward Hounslow. I expected at least to see smoke, fire, or evidence of its work. But all I saw was the deep blue sky above, with one solitary star, and the white mist spreading wide and low beneath. And there had been no crash, no answering outburst. The silence was restored, the minute lengthened to 3. "What has happened?" said the curate, standing beside me. "Heaven knows," said I. A bat flickered by and vanished. A distant tumult of shouting began and ceased. I looked again at the Martian and saw he was moving eastward along the riverbank with a swift, rolling motion. I expected the fire of some hidden battery to spring upon him every moment, but the evening calm was unbroken. The figure of the Martian grew smaller as he receded, and presently the mist and the gathering night had swallowed him up. By a common impulse, we clambered higher. Towards Sunbury was a dark appearance, as though a conical hill had suddenly come into being there, hiding our view of the farther country, and then, remoter across the river, we saw another such summit over Walton. These hill-like forms grew lower and broader even as we stared. Moved by a sudden thought, I looked northward, and there I perceived a third of these cloudy black copies had risen. Everything had suddenly become very still. Far away to the southeast, marking the quiet, we heard the Martians hooting to one another, and then the air quivered again with the distant thud of their guns. But the earthly artillery made no reply. Now we could not understand these things at the time, but later I was to learn the meaning of these ominous copies that gathered in the twilight. Each of the Martians, standing in the great crescent I have described, had discharged, through the gun-like tube he carried, a huge canister over whatever hill, copse, cluster of houses, or another possible cover for guns, chanced to be in front of him. Some fired only one of these, some two, as in the case of the one we had seen. The one at Ripley is said to have discharged no fewer than 5 at that time. These canisters smashed on striking the ground, they did not burst, and incontinently disengaged an enormous volume of heavy, inky vapor, coiling and pouring upward in a vast, ebony cumulus cloud gaseous hill that sank and spread itself slowly over the surrounding country. And the touch of that vapor, inhaling its pungent wisps, was death to all that breathes. It was heavy, this vapor, more severe than the densest smoke, so that, after the first tumultuous uprush and outflow of its impact, it sank through the air and poured over the ground in a manner relatively liquid than gaseous, abandoning the hills, and streaming into the valleys and ditches and watercourses, even as I have heard the carbonic acid gas that pours from volcanic clefts is wont to do. And where it came upon the water, some chemical action occurred, and the surface would be instantly covered with a powdery scum that sank slowly and made way for more. The scum was insoluble, and seeing the instant effect of the gas, it was a strange thing that one could drink without hurting the water from which it had been strained. The vapor did not diffuse as an accurate gas would do. It hung together in banks, flowing sluggishly down the slope of the land and driving reluctantly before the wind, and very slowly, it combined with the mist and moisture of the air and sank to the earth in the form of dust. Save that an unknown element giving a group of 4 lines in the blue of the spectrum is concerned, we are still entirely ignorant of the nature of this substance. Once the tumultuous upheaval of its dispersion was over, the black smoke clung so closely to the ground, even before its precipitation, that 50 feet up in the air, on the roofs and upper stories of high houses and great trees, there was a chance of escaping its poison altogether, as was proved even that night at Street Cobham and Ditton. The man who escaped from the former place tells a beautiful story of the strangeness of its coiling flow and how he looked down from the church spire and saw the village's houses rising like ghosts out of its inky nothingness. For a day and a half, he remained there, weary, starving, and sun-scorched, the earth under the blue sky and against the prospect of the distant hills a velvet black expanse, with red roofs, green trees, and, later, black-veiled shrubs and gates, barns, outhouses, and walls, rising here and there into the sunlight. But that was at Street Cobham, where the black vapor was allowed to remain until it sank of its own accord into the ground. As a rule, when it had served its purpose, the Martians cleared the air of it again by wading into it and directing a jet of steam upon it. This they did with the vapor banks near us, as we saw in the starlight from the window of a deserted house at Upper Halliford, whither we had returned. From there, we could see the searchlights on Richmond Hill and Kingston Hill going to and fro, and at about 11, the windows rattled, and we heard the sound of the massive siege guns that had been put in position there. These continued intermittently for a quarter of an hour, sending chance shots at the invisible Martians at Hampton and Ditton, and then the pale beams of the electric light vanished and were replaced by a bright red glow. Then the 4th cylinder fell, a brilliant green meteor, as I learned afterward, in Bushy Park. Before the guns on the Richmond and Kingston line of hills began, there was a fitful cannonade far away in the southwest due, I believe, to guns being fired haphazardly before the black vapor could overwhelm the gunners. So, setting about it as methodically as men might smoke out a wasp's nest, the Martians spread this strange stifling vapor over the London-ward country. The crescent's horns slowly moved apart until, at last, they formed a line from Hanwell to Coombe and Malden. All night their destructive tubes advanced. Never once, after the Martian at St. George's Hill was brought down, did they give the artillery the ghost of a chance against them. Wherever there was a possibility of guns being laid for them unseen, a fresh canister of the black vapor was discharged, and where the guns were openly displayed, the heat ray was brought to bear. By midnight the blazing trees along the slopes of Richmond Park and the glare of Kingston Hill threw their light upon a network of black smoke, blotting out the whole valley of the Thames and extending as far as the eye could reach. And through this, two Martians slowly waded and turned their hissing steam jets this way and that. They were sparing of the heat ray that night, either because they had a limited supply of material for its production or because they did not wish to destroy the country but only to crush and overcome the opposition they had aroused. In the latter aim, they certainly succeeded. Sunday night was the end of the organized opposition to their movements. After that, no men would stand against them, so the enterprise was hopeless. Even the crews of the torpedo boats and destroyers that had brought their quick firers up the Thames refused to stop, mutinied, and went down again. The only offensive operation men ventured upon after that night was the preparation of mines and pitfalls, and even in that, their energies were frantic and spasmodic. One has to imagine, as well as one may, the fate of those batteries towards Esher, waiting so tensely in the twilight. Survivors, there were none. One may picture the orderly expectation, the officers alert and watchful, the gunners ready, the ammunition piled to hand, the limber gunners with their horses and wagons, the groups of civilian spectators standing as near as they were permitted, the evening stillness, the ambulances and hospital tents with the burned and wounded from Weybridge, then the dull resonance of the shots the Martians fired, and the clumsy projectile whirling over the trees and houses and smashing amid the neighboring fields. One may picture, too, the sudden shifting of the attention, the swiftly spreading coils and bellyings of that blackness advancing headlong, towering heavenward, turning the twilight to a palpable darkness, a strange and horrible antagonist of vapor striding upon its victims, men and horses near it seen dimly, running, shrieking, falling headlong, shouts of dismay, the guns suddenly abandoned, men choking and writhing on the ground, and the swift broadening out of the opaque cone of smoke. And then night and extinction, nothing but a silent mass of impenetrable vapor hiding its dead. Before dawn, the black vapor was pouring through the streets of Richmond, and the disintegrating organism of government was, with a last expiring effort, rousing the population of London to the necessity of flight. That is the end of chapter 15. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you at the next one.